So this is DevOps Behavioural Therapy, which is basically some shit I made up. But it's a kind of a combination of ideas that I've been kind of playing around with for a while, in that we spend a lot of time talking about empathy and what that means, but not a lot of time about talking about the roots of empathy or how that shit actually works. Also, pardon my French, I speak it fluently, and I will try really hard to tone it down just because I know that's one of those things that one should do. I'm not good at that. I am sorry. So, it seems customary to start out with a slide with a photo of yourself and your Twitter handle, so here's that. That is the photo that you'll see on Twitter, so you can go ahead and form that mental association. This is a soft talk. You will not learn a dang thing that you can type into your computer. I'm sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and hope that nobody here works with someone who reminds them of this guy. But odds are pretty good that you work with somebody who reminds you of this dude, who treats everything like a game, who really doesn't seem to care about what's going on or how it affects other people. Or like this dude who's so absolutely sure that he's the smartest person in the room that he's willing to risk your job on it. Or your life. And you almost certainly work with somebody like this dude who claims that, you know, he's just a jerk because it's funny and for the lulz. And those folks have a tendency inevitably to turn out to be these guys, and that kind of sucks. So what we're dealing with here is like a profound lack of empathy. And text selects for that for, you know, a variety of reasons. Callousness can be useful. If you don't care, then it's hard to slow down and like break up the build or do boring things like over-test. These people have a tendency to be able to hyper-focus, which is really useful in programming, right? Like if you're sitting there debugging a stack trace, you don't want to be thinking about your little feels. It's not worth it. At the same time, they blow at empathy, like it's just terrible. They don't care about you, they don't care about the customer, they care about feeling like badasses. So, enter Marsha Linehan. She has been treating people who suffer from cluster B personality disorders, so that's like borderline, narcissistic personality disorder, etc., etc. Things that hover around a lack of empathy for, gosh, I want to say like 40 years. I probably should know that, but say la vie. And the format that she uses is called Dialectical Behavioural Therapy. Now, the first time, several times I heard that phrase, I just kind of blew off dialectical as like adding to a dialect, but no, it's, you know, in the Marxist or Hegelian sense of like, we're going to synthesize new forms, we're going to like create new ideas out of oppositional ideas. And my favorite explanation of that is Starbucks Pebbles. So if you're looking at this and you see a pentagon, raise your hand. Yeah. If you're looking at this and you see a 5-pointed star, raise your hand. So Starbucks Pebbles comes from the Principia Discordia. If anyone's read it, go you. If you haven't read it, go do it. It's funny as hell. And the baseline premise is that those of you who raise your hands for a pentagon would be biased towards the aneristic principle, the notion of orderliness, of boredom, almost. And those who raised your hands for a star would be biased towards the eristic principle, or chaos, disorder, wildness, fun, whatever. But what we're actually looking at is like a bunch of points of light that don't really have any relation to each other, and your brain is attempting to impose these ideas upon them. Similarly, we have this nifty little photo here, or is it a photo or is it just more light? You know, is it Plato or is it a statue of Plato? Is it representative or is it figurative? Did the person who carved this even ever see Plato? Trying to integrate these sorts of perceptions into a unified whole is the nature of dialectic as a concept. And the reason that it's used in therapeutic practices is because people who suffer from cluster B personality disorders have a tendency to be inclined towards false dichotomy. In fact, one of the classic books about borderline personality disorder is, well, I don't recall the full title, but the intro to the title is I Love You, I Hate You, right? Like they go back and forth. They're often misdiagnosed as bipolar, And it's just because of this behavioral pattern that they have of wanting to recognize all of the attributes of an entity or an experience, but being unable to integrate them successfully. And so Linehan uses the concept of dialectic to help them integrate those sorts of things. And, you know, who more appropriate to talk to than DevOps people about that? Like, there's one of your sort of difficult to integrate dichotomies, infrastructure and code, another difficult to integrate dichotomy. So that's something that we're already doing in our practices, and we just don't always speak about it from the philosophical perspective, or for that matter, from a therapeutic perspective. But, you know, you already knew that. So one of the key things that Linehan found when trying to resurrect people's empathy is that mindfulness is pretty much the key. If you can relax and accept all of the available input that is coming at you, if you can take in the wholeness of the world and of your experience, then you don't really have to resort to the pentagon or the star or the points of light. You can see all of these things and be aware of them and accept only the one that's appropriate for your moment. You also have the capacity to silence your own ego in these mindful experiences, and that can be really useful for actually taking in like the emotional experiences that other people have attempted to share with you in conversation, or the difficulties that, you know, peers telling you about in their role. You have the opportunity to, through unifying your mind, through centering yourself, to actually do better work, to DevOps harder, and that's pretty powerful. When you stop and listen to that inner voice, when you silence the ego, you free up like tons of background processing threads, rescue jobs, whatever works for your mental model, to focus on the issue at hand rather than on, you know, the fact that you're butthurt because the person you're talking to doesn't like Java or whatever. You know, you have a newfound freedom and almost a superpower, really, by comparison to people who play into our societal tendency to oversimplify. Sorry, I wrote a ton of notes for this thing, and most of them are kind of trash, so I'm kind of sifting through them. I think we're good on this slide. So none of that stuff that I've said so far is really useful as an implementation detail, right? Like, mindfulness is a great idea, and everyone knows that, but doing things about it is actually kind of hard. And that's the core of what Linehan brought us, right? So we, as DevOps professionals, are probably pretty familiar with the idea of kata, right? Like, generally speaking. So was Linehan. She felt that it was really important to boil these things down into repeatable, demonstrable, and somewhat more importantly, memorable subsets of ideas. All right. She originally targeted people who had multiple suicide attempts. So, like, she felt a certain urgency in this work, and more importantly, she knew that these things needed to be easy in an emotionally short-circuited state. If you're of the mind where you can lose control, I probably should have said like trigger warning at the beginning of this, because I talk about suicide and painful experiences a fair bit here, so fair warning. If you're in a state of mind where you could make such a rash decision as to attempt to take your own life, probably the tool that you're going to reach for, if not a razor, needs to be like as small and as immediately available to you as possible. So some of these ideas might seem like a little cheesy, but when you consider the target and the goal, I think that it helps cement their purpose. So we as tech professionals have a tendency towards the left-hand side of this Venn diagram, right? Like, if we were to describe a decision as purely emotionally motivated, that's almost derogatory for most of us. And that's kind of unfortunate, right? Because we're dualistic people, like both just as human beings and specifically as DevOpsers, whatever that happens to mean in your particular work. So it's important to be able to focus on, again, like the dialectic earlier, the integrative experience, and Linehan chose to call that wise mind. So I guess to try and link that to something a little bit implementable, how many of you have a technology that you would love to start using, but you just can't because your coworkers just hate it? When they talk about how much they hate it, do they speak of it from a purely emotional point of view, or do they try to make a claim that this is a reasoned thing, that their experiences were just so overwhelmingly horrible that it is proof positive, logical, reason-based thinking that it just can't work out, even though you happen to know better? By encouraging the people around you to attempt to use this integrative thought process, usually the only way that I've found to encourage people to do this is by demonstrating it, by doing it myself, you end up with a richer conversation around these things. In the short term, in the purely selfish motivation, you might get to use this thing that you want to use, but in the longer term, you're making richer business decisions and you are, more efficient as a result. Also, it's worth noting too that our overemphasis on the reasonable mind, coupled with the way that Western society functions, has a tendency to reinforce, systemic biases against certain groups of people. Specifically, in this case, your traditional gender biases. It's sort of an assumed given that women are more emotional, and so if it's an assumed given that reasonable mind is better, and an assumed given that women are more emotional, we get pretty disrespectful pretty quickly, and it's not useful to anyone. It's another thing that stands in the way of empathy, both interpersonally and interdepartmentally. So I've tried to give some examples of ways that you can start structuring questions to bring out other people's wise minds. Now, admittedly, I'm not super good at this. In fact, honestly, if this were DevOps days, I'd be totally begging for an open space right now so that we can start discussing these things. But the two examples that I wrote down, at least, are what makes you uncomfortable with garbage collection? Is it actually a reasoned thing? Is it that you saw? Sorry, this is super distracting. Or is it that you saw something that just made you upset, that made you mad? Is it that you just don't like Rob Pike or Brendan Ike or whoever happened to design the language that you're arguing against right now? Or is there a particular outcome that you're fearing with regard to the switch that I'm suggesting, that allows people to bring up both their rational concerns and their emotive concerns, and it displays that you're open and validating to both of those notions. Let's see. So when we bring vulnerability and honesty in that way to our conversations, when we say, please open both your rational and your emotive minds to me, both through our actions and through our words, I think that we end up with a more honest conversation and a deeper connection. And I think that will yield both business gains and just good feels. And why should work suck? Why should we, not optimize for feeling good? So one of the katas that Linehan advocates for is, observe, describe, participate, although it would be more accurately just shown as observe, describe, participate, because the key piece there is that she doesn't want to interact with egotistical judgments. She wants people to focus very heavily on the sensory input that they're receiving and accurate output that reflects that. So, right now, I could say that I'm really uncomfortable because I'm looking at a way bigger group of people than I expected. Or I could note that the back of my neck has become tense, that I feel warmth on my face, that my heart is beating a little bit faster than I anticipated, that I haven't unscrunched my arms in 10 minutes. These are all objective descriptions of reality rather than, egotistical descriptions of how I feel about it. And by trying to separate from the egoism in, I'm uncomfortable to, oh, my neck is tense, I can actually do shit about that, right? Like, my neck is tense. If I feel like it, and, it's not too awkward, I can actually, like, rub that out while I'm talking to you. I'm not going to, because that's awkward as hell, but I could, And it's the beginning of something that she refers to as non-judgmental stance, which is that rather than rush to let the ego speak, to form concretions that aren't really there, to see the pentagram or the pentagon, to just sit and take in the data and make sure that you have both of those forms and that you're choosing the one that suits your purposes rather than the one that gratifies your ego. And then once you've observed and you've described, when you choose to participate with that wholeness. Incorporate all of the things that you observed, not just the one that makes you feel best. A slightly more applicable mnemonic that she proposed is give. And it's intended to smooth over interpersonal interactions, specifically for people who struggle with them. It's worth noting that DBT is often applied to like teenagers or people who are like presently hospitalized. So some of these things are both more simplistic than one might expect, and I don't really know how to substantiate this. Well, anyway, they're more simplistic than one might expect. So this one is gentle, which is to say that we don't want to incorporate rude words, gestures, and when I say rude gestures, I'm not just talking about like the finger or whatever. Like, if I'm looking around and I'm seeing eye rolls or whatnot, and I'm not trying to call anyone out because that would be rude, also because I haven't seen that. Thanks, guys. Those things have impacts that can be significant, and we don't want to downplay that or to dismiss it just because it's not the finger, because it's not me shouting obscenities. We want to be gentle in as many ways as we're capable of facilitating at that moment, and that that facilitates connection. It helps with empathy, schmackety, so the whole thing that we're discussing here. We want to make sure that we both appear and genuinely are interested. And she speaks to the physicality of this as well as to the mental state. So, like, if you're standing and talking to somebody, lean in or mirror them. Maintain your eye contact, which, is something that I imagine not just I struggle with in here. Nod, don't interrupt, make sure that not only are you interested, but that the person that you're talking to can tell. She expects us to be validating. That is to say that we want to give active responses. One thing that's suggested, so you have the physical mirroring, right? Like if you're standing across from somebody talking to them and they cross their arms, you cross your arms, And that's something that has a tendency to happen naturally in people. But there's also like a sense of verbal mirroring. So if I say like, God, this week has been terrible, and you hear me, if you want to be validating, one thing that you can do is say, oh yeah, it sounds like you've had a pretty hard week. And just the simple act of restating it, even though sometimes it might be moderately annoying to the person, on a deeper level, it has a tendency to open them up, to make them realize that whatever they're feeling, even if they feel that it's ridiculous, you feel that it's acceptable. And then they're freer to share with you, and we're freer to empathize as a result. And finally, be easygoing. Bring your humor, bring compliments, bring the happier side of yourself. To the extent that you can, especially at work, there's not really a reason to be hostile or depressing if it's good. She also gives fast, and fast is more of like a survival technique. So if give is, I want to build empathy with you, fast is, I don't want to freak out right now. So she speaks of fairness in fast, and the fairness that she's speaking of in this case is not just, to the person that you're talking to or to your environment, but to yourself. A lot of people who express these anempathic traits, they come from environments that are abusive or non-validating or hostile. They've had experiences in the past that makes their life difficult for them to share with others. And so when they interact, that comes out. You have a tendency to see people who are true in groups that are marginalized by the dominant culture. And so one of the advocacies that Linehan makes is that we should be unapologetic. That we don't apologize for being. If I actually wrong you, sure, I owe you something, an apology, a kindness, whatever. But saying like, oh, I'm sorry that I spoke too loud, or oh, I'm sorry that I asked you to turn that down, or I'm sorry that I need something, or I'm sorry that I bumped into you when I was just standing here occupying space. Like, those things get kind of ridiculous, and it becomes self-reinforcing. As people behave in this way, people around them start to expect them to behave in this way. She encourages her patients to stick to their values because, again, if you're used to these invalidating, uncomfortable environments, it's really normal to say, oh, well, I guess the first thing that I should do to get along is I should compromise who the hell I am. And that's been kind of a running theme I've seen recently, like bring your whole self to work has popped up in my Twitter feed, like people are trying to bring more of this. But for folks with mental health issues, that can be really hard. It's also important, though, for those who don't have mental health issues. Like, we want to make sure that when we're having these conversations, we're engaging in holism. If, for instance, your team wants to switch to GitHub, but you're offended by like some of the actions of the CEO, which I think is actually not an uncommon state, speak to that, right? Like, share those values. Don't just like sit around and stuff that and be uncomfortable just because it's an unpopular opinion. Those things result in companies, businesses at large, making poor decisions because no one was willing to stand up for the oppositional view that could have prevented it. And finally, and relatedly, be honest, both with yourself and with other people. So, I gotta say, like, this, this is a little bit touchy-feely. This is like HR material, and that's not generally something that I find that tech professionals around me really like. This is, the predominant attitude towards human resources around pretty much every tech group that I've interacted with. But tech can be kind of toxic. Like, we have this baseline notion that we need to relate to the computer. So you have this box in front of you that does what it's told, and you optimize for that relation. And if that means that your relations with other human beings suffer, so be it. And that's not really acceptable anymore. Like, there's no individual developer, at least not in my organization, who can get by without input from finance, from product ownership, from human resources. These things become important to their lives, but we allow people, or at least we historically have allowed people, to pretend that they're not. And I have to admit, like, I'm unapologetically agendaed here about this. Like, I've been in work situations that were hella uncomfortable to me because of other people's anempathic behavior. Like, that's not necessary, and it's really avoidable. So, I've talked a lot about the specifics of some of the baseline DBT kata, and I had intended when I proposed this talk to try and like go through a meditation or whatever, and in fact, just to share one of those before I move on to my next subject, one thing that I've really enjoyed as an awareness meditation is something that I picked up from 2600 magazine like 10 years ago, and it's like a wideness of vision, really, exercise. So you go out to like Target or the Mall of America, somewhere where there's bustling activity, and you center yourself in that bustling activity. So I'm gonna pretend that you guys are all moving and not just sitting there staring expectantly. And you pick a point in the distance, so I am now looking at the edge of that little metal bit there behind the gentleman in the purple shirt, and you focus whole-mindedly on that point. And then you progressively expand the amount of data that you're taking in from the environment. So, like, I can see the point itself, the guy with the purple shirt that I just mentioned, gentleman in the striped shirt there, moving outwards. This guy with the beard and the black shirt, blue over here, some green plaid, except I'm moving my eyes because I'm presenting and terrified rather than meditating. But you widen the focus, and what you find is, one, your peripheral vision is way the hell wider than you use. And two, and this is way more important, you're capable of taking in a monumental amount of information at any given time. And that can be really self-soothing and useful when you're trying to, say, I don't know, learn all of Puppet in a week so that you can start deploying. Anyway, I had intended to do more of this sort of thing, but then I realized that I wanted to talk more about empathy itself, right? Because that's what I put on the bill. And I think that an easy way to examine empathy, and a dialectic way to examine empathy, is to talk about the exact opposite of that. So, I developed a really deep interest in sociopathy recently, because it's a little bit petrifying as a concept that, there's people wandering around amongst us who just don't give a shit that other people exist and that they have lives and that they have boundaries that would end you just to know what that felt like. So I spent a lot of time reading about it, and it seems like one of the core things about them is that they freaking lack empathy. Go figure. But then there's specific traits that we've observed about that lack of empathy. I read Confessions of a Sociopath, which is a really great book by Emmy Thomas. And she talks about her childhood very briefly because she doesn't consider it important. She felt like her childhood was pretty average and that she had normal kid experiences. In that same chapter, she talks about being beaten by her parents repeatedly, about how her and her siblings were left to compete for parental attention constantly, and how her basic form of life was to win those inter-sibling competitions. That sounds like a recipe to kill empathy. Bob Hare did a whole bunch of sociopath studies, and he saw so many people from damaged homes, from invalidating environments, that his original conclusion before we saw some of the brain scan studies was that that's the sole cause of sociopathy, that all of the cluster B behavior, that narcissism, borderline, any disorder that you see that revolves around a lack of empathy and an inability to relate, a lack of personality really is what it ends up being, comes from a destructive environment. But that's oversimplistic, and we're dealing with something that's clearly multidimensional. And especially when we actually look at the physical sensory data that's available to us about these people, there's not a whole lot of this out there because, well, it's really dangerous to pull somebody who has proven themselves to be a psychopath out of imprisonment or therapy to scan their brain just for the hell of it. But we have quite a number of those scans nonetheless, and what we find is kind of a trifecta of neurological difference. We see that we have smaller amygdalas, which is typically correlated with reduced emotionality and, in fact, reduced emotional capacity. That is to say that while your emotional spectrum might include 700 values, theirs might only include as few as 70. We see an enlarged corpus callosum, so that's like the joining piece between the two hemispheres of the brain. So their left and right brain, rather than being able to separately process and really dispatch in the same way that ours do, are constantly interacting. And that leads to not necessarily any of the more destructive elements of sociopathy, but certainly a distinct neurological difference. That is to say that as you process an idea and as a sociopath processes an idea, the paths that it will follow are not even kind of similarly traceable. And finally, you see abnormal frontal lobe development. So that's going to be reduced inhibition, a reduced sense of calculating behavior. I was reviewing the sociopath test by John Ronson this morning because, like everybody else I know, I prepare for talks really, really late. And he talked to a bunch of CEOs that he believed to have sociopathic traits, and constantly they found themselves using phrases like, I don't need friends, or I just look at the data and decide. Whereas we find that, you know, typically, traditionally effective people are more plotting, are more planning than that. You know, they want to actually see an idea through rather than act on impulse. So I've used words, pathologizing words like sociopath or bipolar throughout this talk because that's what the popular terminology is. But really what we're dealing with is several intersecting spectrums of neurodiversity, and reducing those to pathologies is basically impossible, but we did it anyway. So we're not actually dealing with the whole situation. And so to kind of slide back to those first slides, each of those fictional or non-fictional people that I presented you guys with is on, you know, a different point on all three of those spectrums, and as a result, they have different functional capacities and bring amazing things related to their disordered behavior to the table. But if we can work with them and we can spend time with them and help them build empathy, then they can bring even more amazing things to the table. And so I want to talk about how to do that for them, but you can't do that for anyone else. You can only do that for yourself. We can only work to be good role models. We can demonstrate our own empathy, and we can show that it brings richness to our lives, and we can practice and enhance that, even at the expense of other skill development if necessary, in order to ensure that, you know, we're shining knights of empathy, roughly. And I think that through that behavior, and, you know, to the point that was brought up earlier of how to spread DevOps, by doing it really hard, we can demonstrate its value. I don't know when I was supposed to finish, but that's pretty much all I've got. So if anybody wants to ask some stuff, that's swell.
Well, first off, that was fantastic. My only reaction is wow. Any others?
I just wanted to say something about the whole connection between DevOps and this idea of behavioral therapy. But where I used to work, one of the biggest problems with DevOps was getting Dev and Ops to talk to each other. We were on different floors. We were like at war with each other practically, and just, I mean, that empathy, the empathy between the departments, not even just individual people, but the whole departments just didn't communicate at all. It was like, you know, there was no empathy at all. We were like totally at cross purposes with each other, which obviously affected our ability to do, you know, DevOps at all, you know. But even old school, you know, release management type manual releases got in the way.
Absolutely, that's somewhat unsurprising. I before my current job at Gov Delivery, which is awesome, and we're hiring, and I'm supposed to say that everywhere, right? I worked for a local Minneapolis company that provides a backup product, and we had a very similar relationship there, where like, so. Yeah, I shouldn't talk because there's a camera. I was just about to say something. Well, anyway, we had a very adversarial ops development boundary related to the release cycles and what was perceived to be appropriate to throw into a release. And yeah, just like the simple act of having those people talk to each other and connect more, even on just like a beer and chatter level, would have made that company significantly faster, but instead they're going through rapid leadership changes, so whatever.
It's interesting to note that, you know, a lot of the things that you describe aren't just, you know, between people who are, you know, all have Asperger's syndrome, but are also broadly applicable to just healthy relationships in the office in general. I mean, the adversarial relationship that some of us, say, have with HR. You know, like the kind of behavior you describe as the engaging and powerful and empathetic behavior is the kind of stuff that we should be showing to all of our coworkers, and not just necessarily the idiot who pushed something or broke all the tests.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, so I had meant to include another slide here of resources, but I didn't. But one of the resources that I wanted to include is Nonviolent Communication, which is a book that I've started 5 times and put down 5 times. I haven't finished it yet. But every time I start it up, it reminds me that, like, you have these tools that are developed to help people with disorders or whatever, but they help everybody. Like, it's really important to flex our brains and, dare I use this little 4-letter word here, our souls as muscles. Like, it's valuable, period. There's no, it's valuable for this type of person or that type of person. Showing a stunning lack of empathy, making time run all over the place.
Do you think, a lot of companies think that, exercise is bullshit, like, you need to work like 12-hour days. Do you think they view that empathy is a luxury in the work environment when there's just that one issue, why are you being nice to people?
Dude, totally. And I think that the forest that they're missing while they're staring at the trees is that, like, if I work a 12-hour day, I'm absolute garbage for the second 6 hours. Like, it's totally pointless to do that to people. What we're doing here is we're just, like, encouraging people to write more bugs, which makes them look more productive, but does jack shit for the company itself. And yeah, totally, like, it's a hard sell to management sometimes. I feel like the only thing that you can do is demonstrate it, and even then, if you don't interact with the right people, you don't get an opportunity to do that. I got to hear Jeff Sussna, who's way the hell wiser than I ever would have predicted, share a piece of advice in an open space during DevOps days. If you can't change your job, change your job.
Are there any companies, either local or national or global, that you think really have nailed the empathy thing?
Dude, I have no idea. Like, I study empathy for my personal development because, honestly, like, I wouldn't self-identify as a sociopath, but I would certainly self-identify as having struggled with it. I thought that LARTs were just the coolest thing ever when I heard about that. I thought Master Operator from Hell was the funniest thing. But I haven't studied it on a corporate level beyond the ones that I've interacted with, that I've worked at.
So you just said you're not studying it on a corporate level, but if you're trying to sell this to a CFO or a CIO and try to sell your vision for empathy, like, what are 1 or 2 things you do that are actionable,
I haven't yet. I'm a plebe. Like, as far as that goes, I do my job and I go home. If I were to, like, imagine myself as more empowered, which really is just a matter of getting up and doing shit, right? Like, everybody's empowered. But if I were to try to sell this to, say, my boss at my last job, having the experience that I've gained since I left, I would probably do it by just interacting with him, by talking to him about the problems that he's personally facing. Like, hey, sorry, I gotta put an anonymizing name. Hey, Bob, what are you experiencing right now that shits up your day on a regular basis? Oh, wow, man, that's really terrible. Like, I feel you. Like, oh, you can't get a release out because every time that you try to initiate a test cycle, development adds 5 new features? That sounds horribly painful. And just to spend time with him and validate his experiences, and unfortunately it's pretty much always him, so that that person then feels more free to do the same for their employees. I think that having a positive experience with somebody who's, like, empathying really hard at them is the best selling point that I could give. Sorry that that's not 2 things.
So you'd mentioned sort of wanting to add slides for resources. Have you taken the mental health first aid class from OSMI? Are you familiar with that?
Not at all. What's that?
Ed Finkler, who started some of the open sourcing mental illness and sort of bringing more of the discussion to the development community, in particular about mental illness and challenges, has set up a first aid class for mental health issues rather than just cuts, bruises, heart attacks. It's, you know, how do you have empathy towards people and help them bring their whole selves to the office? And I haven't taken it yet, but it's on my empathy.
No, that'll be something that I do probably this week. That's really rad. In fact, so since I failed at my job of providing a resources slide, I am going to just tweet a bunch of resources at DevOpsMN, and if anyone wants to do the same, that would be super swell. I know I'll read them.
All right. Anything else? Okay. I want to give you another round of applause.